Hello everybody! I am back. Rather predictable me. I never really go anywhere. I just live in this room and talk to you guys. But yeah, how are you all doing? Hope you're having a lovely day. We are now quite close to the end of Hellraisers. And onto the third part. So Marlowe and Pan and the rest of the Hellraisers are facing this battle between them and the Circulus Inferni, who are this evil group led by Mammon, and they just had this big battle in Budapest, and Marlowe and Pan found Charlie there, Marlowe's old friend who Marlowe abandoned. Charlie was almost killed, but they put him into the engine, and he looks like he might do okay. He's come back, and Marlowe has now got to go off and do a mission. But as he was going, Charlie looked at him from his hospital bed and said, "They're lying to you." So we don't know who is lying. We don't know what they might be lying about. All we know is the story must continue. So yeah, I hope you're sitting comfortably. We shall begin. This next chapter is called Homecoming. Pan hated touching down in America. It was always too much like going back in time. The plane's engines powered down and she popped the clasp on her belt, stretching like a cat. She'd slept for most of the journey, they all had, and despite the fact she'd been playing leapfrog with time zones for the last couple of days, she felt relatively awake, just the familiar ebb and pull of the engine making her ache. She flexed her fingers, careful not to think too hard about what she'd traded for this time. One sideways thought, and she'd take out the plane and everyone inside it. Not to mention a good chunk of the airport. She peered out the window as the plane taxied towards the small tower. This was the point she always dreaded. The cop cars screaming around the corner, the chopper descending. She'd been a felon the first time she'd flown out of the airport, and Herc had turned her into a fugitive by busting her out of her cell. She was still wanted for her original crime, and it wasn't like she'd been lying low since. She'd lost track of what she was guilty of now in the eyes of the law. Arson, check. Theft, check. Assault, definitely. GTA, many, many times. And murder? That was one she hadn't lost count of. She knew exactly how many lives she'd taken, and each one burned a hole in her dreams every night. All in the name of duty, though, right? At least that's what she told herself when they came calling, the dead faces of those she'd shot, stabbed, run over, and those who'd been ravaged by demons because she'd been too slow to save them. It's what she told herself when the guilt made her want to scream herself to death. If she didn't do what she did, then the world would fall. Each of those deaths held the gates of hell closed. That knowledge was the only thing that kept her sane. They jolted to a stop, and Pan walked to the door, wrestling with the lever until it popped open. The stairs descended automatically, and she hopped down them into the heat and smog and noise of a sweaty Jersey afternoon. Ostein would have already put the word in, greased the palms of the airport officials. It was pretty hard to get into the US undetected, but it wasn't like the Hellraisers were short of money. Turned out that trading the engine for a small fortune was one of the easiest contracts to break. And even the most anally retentive official was willing to turn a blind eye if you stuffed enough cash in his pocket. No, their route out of the field was guaranteed. "Oh, I wish they'd find a way to put a red door over here," said Knight, massaging her back with both hands as she strolled down the stairs. I mean, how hard can it be? Rerouting the pathways that accessed the engine, rewriting the old magic that kept it out of space and out of time. It was just about the hardest thing you could attempt to do. Knight had a point, though. Sticking a red door in the middle of Manhattan would be a hell of a lot easier than a 9-hour plane trip between contracts. At least this way, though, you didn't have to walk through pure evil to get where you were going. Knight skipped lightly down the steps, and Truck followed her, almost too big to get out of the aeroplane door. He stomped down, heavy-lidded, still half asleep. The big guy was always half asleep. "You just take your time," Pan said to him, tapping her foot with impatience. "Mosey on down at your leisure, not like we're on a mission or anything." Keep your hair on, Pan," Truck said, swaying down the steps. He glanced at her short locks and snorted. "Oops, too late." "Sides splitting," she said, feeling too exposed here in the airport, feeling like she was back in the past, blood on her hands and the cops on the way. "Seriously, we need to go, and would somebody get Marlowe out of the goddamn toilet?" The safe house was a walk-up in Hoboken. Am I saying that right? Hoboken? Don't think I've ever said it out loud before. The safe house was a walk-up in Hoboken. I'm ruining it now. Hoboken. I'm going to go for Hoboken. Anyone who's from Bohoken, let me know. Bohoken? Right, Stockholm. And it obviously hadn't been used in a while. It was like stepping into a mausoleum, thick with dust and dark, the heavy drapes drawn tight against the heat outside. The only piece of furniture in the combined living room was a couch, still in its plastic wrap, and Truck shouted "Dibs!" before launching himself at it. Pam was amazed that the pair of them didn't disappear through the floor into the apartment below. She waited for everyone to step inside before closing the door and turning the deadbolt. "Why do these places always have to be so dreary?" Knight said, tugging at the drapes. The light... Excuse me. The light flooded in like a dam had been breached, waves of dust billowing out. Pan was pretty sure she saw some mice darting into the skirting. Yeah, the Hellraisers might have been richer than Croesus. I'm not doing very well today. Cressus, maybe? You don't read them aloud when you write them. But they were stingier than Scrooge McDuck. It's not like a room at the Intercontinental would have broken the bank. She coughed out a lungful of dust and walked to the kitchen, slinging her bag onto the counter. Through the greasy window she could see another building, a mirror reflection of their own. Past that, across the Hudson, lay Manhattan, drenched in sunlight. She wondered what would happen if she just walked down the stairs, crossed the river, disappeared into the heat, did her best to forget about the engine and Ostheim and the dead. She checked her watch. 654 hours, 32 minutes, 20 seconds, 11 milliseconds. It would be 26 days of bliss, then an eternity of hell. It was one of the rules. Go AWOL during a contract, and the lawyers won't break it. That's not worth it, Pam. Besides, it really did look like they had a chance to catch Patrick. The fight in Budapest had injured him, but this was something else. He thought they were responsible for his sister's death, and it looked like it had driven him insane. It looked like it had forced him to go renegade. If Patrick was gunning for revenge, then he'd be alone and thoughtless, and all of that would make him easier to find. Maybe this would be the mission that ended it all, the one that set her free. She opened her bag, blinking sunlight out of her eyes. The laptop was state-of-the-art, and she booted it up, connecting with the pigeon's nest through a secure satellite connection. Herc's face appeared, and he didn't look so hot. "Oh, sorry, I must have the wrong number," said Pan. "I think I've connected to an old people's home." "Pan," said Herc. "Is your grandson around? His name's Herc, white hair, face like a dog-chewed catcher's mitt." "Pan, it's late, and I'm tired, and I will gladly murder all of the lawyers in this place and leave you to the demons if you don't quit it. Sorry, Gramps," she said, unable to stop the smile from spreading. "We've arrived. Have you got anything?" He's in Manhattan," Herc said, rubbing his stubble. "We've been monitoring all channels and he's uptown. He isn't hiding, Pam." "Any sign of my mom?" "Nothing. But keep your eyes open. That bastard snuck right up on us last time." "Will do, boss. You rest up. Get your slippers on. Put something nice on the gramophone. Go for boop!" She cut the connection, stretching in the little pool of sunlight by the window. It truly was filthy in here, reminding her of the apartment she'd grown up in, a hellhole in Queens. The memory made her skin crawl, and she turned her back on it, walking into the sitting room. Knight and Marlowe were staring out of the window, chatting quietly. Truck looked like he'd fallen asleep. She almost smiled at the sight. Then she remembered the others, the fallen, those who'd been murdered right in front of her eyes, and those who'd been dragged, kicking and screaming, to hell. You couldn't have friends in this line of work. You couldn't get attached. "Herc's going to let us know when they've zeroed in," she said. Marlowe turned to her, just a silhouette against the glowing city. "How long will it be?" "Not soon enough," she replied, walking to the sofa and kicking Truck until he grudgingly made room. She collapsed, her leg jiggling impatiently. The waiting was always the worst part. "Just get some rest." And Marlowe... "Yeah?" She gave him the fiercest look she could muster. "I don't want to see you doing your vanishing act again. Okay?" He grinned at her. "Yeah, sure." And the next chapter, rather predictably, is called Doing the Vanishing Act Again. Being back on Staten Island felt like waking up from a dream, and it was a good feeling. Walking out of the ferry terminal into the cool golden evening, Marlowe found himself wishing that the events of the last few days were some kind of hallucination, a machine that let you play with the fundamental laws of physics, demons that came after you when you did. It was insane. Maybe he'd fallen asleep on the ferry, lulled into nightmares as it swayed across the upper bay. Here now, with people bustling past him, tourists snapping pictures, suits heading home from late nights in the city, tired children yelling, there could be no such thing as monsters. It was just him, in the place he'd lived his whole life. Then his new cell buzzed for the 4th time and he saw Pan's text there. "Get your stupid ass back here, Marlowe. Last chance." And the world flipped upside down again, like a stunt plane. Of course it was real. He'd seen it, felt it, been beaten half to death by it. He could still feel the power of the engine thrumming inside him. He knew that he only had to start running and that time itself would slow down to accommodate him. He checked his watch, those numbers counting down relentlessly. Thought about what would happen when it reached 0, what would come after him. Yeah, there were definitely monsters. He battered back a quick text, "Won't be long." Then he pocketed the cell and set off. Technically, he hadn't disobeyed Pan. She'd said she didn't want to see him disappear, and she hadn't. She'd been fast asleep on the couch when he left. Besides, he needed to go home, needed to check on his mum. He could have taken a bus, but at this time of day it would have been quicker to walk. It was further than he thought, though, and by the time he reached his street, the sun was hovering over the rooftops, nesting in the trees, making it look like the island was on fire. His legs were grumbling as he walked up the steps to his house, but there was a song in his heart he hadn't heard for what felt like forever. He was smiling as he pushed open the door. "Yo, Mum," he said, walking into the cool interior. "Donovan, here, boy." There was a familiar scrabble of claws on wood, a gentle ruff from the dining room. Donovan skittered around the corner, tongue dangling, tail wagging, and Marlowe dropped to one knee, slapping his legs. "Oh, come here, Dee, I missed you." The dog stopped, his tail drooping like a guillotine blade. He took a few clumsy steps back, cocking his head and whining from the darkness at the end of the corridor. "Hey, stupid, what's up?" Marlowe said, scooching closer. The fur on the dog's neck began to rise, the skin around his mouth pulling back to reveal teeth. Donovan whined again, then barked twice. "Ruff, ruff!" Sorry, I know you all know what a bark sounds like. Then barked twice, the kind of bark usually reserved for yappy dogs in the park, or for strangers. "Hey, dude, it's me," Marlowe said, patting his legs again. When he disappeared for a couple of days, Donovan usually had him on the floor by now, that pink tongue trying to lick his face off. The dog's eyes were huge and white, and there was a definite growl throbbing in his throat. Marlowe stood up, and Donovan flinched, retreating to the wall, that growl like a generator. He barked again, white foam flecking his mouth. "Better get out," came a voice from the back of the house. His mum, her words slurred. "Dog'll tear you a new one." "Mum, it's me," he yelled. It's Marlowe." Footsteps, soft and slow. The dog looked to the side, whined, licked its lips. Then his mum was there, squinting around the corner. There was a glass of Bacardi in her hand, and she was swaying like they were at sea. But it was good to see her. Marlowe smiled, taking a step towards her, but Donovan barked again, his hackles fully raised. "Jesus, Mum," he said, trying to laugh it off. "What have you been feeding him?" His mum didn't answer. Just stared at him, studying him like he was a TV show with crappy reception. The only noise in the house was that pulsing growl from Donovan's throat. "Mum?" Marlowe said, his gut churning. She leaned forward, her face screwing up. "Marley?" "Yeah," he said, it's me. What's going on? I'm sorry I went away. I've been somewhere. I've got a job, I guess. I should have called, but you wouldn't believe. Not him." His mum whispered, the words almost lost beneath Donovan's growl. What? "You're not him," she said, jabbing her glass at him so violently that some of the alcohol slopped out over the dog's head. Donovan didn't even notice, padding forward on those big feet, barking wildly. "Ruff, ruff, ruff!" Marlowe took a step back, crashing into the door. "You're not my son. You're not my Marley." "Mum, please," he said. The dog was still advancing, and Marlowe scrabbled for the doorknob. "Donovan, boy, it's me." The dog was running now, and Marlowe ripped open the door, tripping out and pulling it shut behind him. Donovan thumped against it, his claws scraping at the wood. Marlowe crawled back on his ass, almost rolling down the steps. By the time he'd found his feet again, he could hear his mum behind the door, screaming, "What have you done with him? What have you done with my boy?" He backed away, out onto the street, clamping his hands to his ears. "You're not him! You killed him! You killed my Marley!" Oh, this couldn't be real. "You killed my boys! My boys!" He turned, blinded by tears, not caring where he was going. He just had to get that voice out of his head, that awful, fear-choked, desperate cry. My Marley! You killed him!" A horn blared, tyres screeched, and he looked to see a car next to him. The red-faced driver throwing him the bird. Marlowe lashed out before he even knew what he was doing, a thumping blow that flipped the car into the air like it was made of tin foil. It crunched down, riding a wave of sparks along the street before finally grinding to a halt. Marlowe stood there, shaking his head, wondering whether he should help. Then another car pulled up, somebody yelling at him. Doors were opening along the street, a woman's voice yelling for somebody to call the cops. Marlowe ran, knowing for sure now that there were monsters in the world, and knowing that he was one of them. Poor Marley. Brought some water today, I remembered. The next chapter is called Confessions. Try this one, said Pan, pointing up the hill. Truck steered the colon car. I don't know what's wrong with me today. Truck steered the stolen car around the corner, honking the horn at a delivery van that was blocking both lanes. Tired of waiting and not wanting another Budapest incident, they'd driven to Staten Island in search of Marlowe. Pan was planning to throw him in the trunk as soon as they found him, keep him there till this whole thing was over. Luckily, Marlowe wasn't exactly clever or subtle. She figured he'd probably head straight home. You guys found him yet? Herc barked in her ear, speaking through the open channel from the pigeon's nest. Damn it, Herc, she spat back. Do you have to ask every 30 seconds? Is that him? Knight asked, leaning between the two front seats and pointing. Pan looked to see Marlowe up ahead, staggering down the hill, his expression vacant. Kids have been playing with my microphone. It's been facing the wrong way. I hope you've heard me all right. Staggering down the hill, his expression vacant. That ain't Marlowe, said Truck, pulling the car to the curb. That's a zombie. Truck, said Pan. I seem to remember that when you got your first contract, you were so upset you went away and broke into the Empire Bakery. Nope, he said, shaking his head. Not me. Yeah, we found you curled up in the corner, crying like a baby. That was definitely somebody else, said Truck, squirming in his seat. You'd eaten 14 donuts. It was 18 donuts, actually, he grumbled, and it still wasn't me. Pan popped the door and stepped into the cool evening air. Circle the block, she said. I'll talk to him. Just try not to kill him, Knight said as they drove away. Marlowe stomped towards her, his eyes red and puffy, his chest heaving. He was close enough to touch before he noticed her, and when he did, he turned away sharply, wiping his face. What do you want? He asked, sniffling like a baby. I came to check on you, she said. See if you needed your diaper changed. He spun back, fists clenched, and she took a step away. Marlowe could probably knock her head clean off right now if he wanted to, and if she defended herself, she'd turn half the street to dust. You don't know what it's like, he said. Oh yeah, I've never ever been in your shoes. She tried to swallow the rest of her sarcasm, taking a deep breath and blowing it out slowly. Marlowe, we've all been here. Come on, let's get off the street. We can talk. Yeah, he snapped back. Talk about how my mum doesn't recognise me, how my dog tried to chew my throat out. Count to 10, Pan, she told herself, reaching 5 before she ran out of patience. She grabbed Marlowe's arm and pulled him into an alleyway between 2 rows of houses. The sun had all but disappeared, just a smudge of dirty orange against the horizon, and there were no lights down here. Marlowe was 2 dark, sad eyes blinking in the twilight. He shrugged himself free and stood, snivelling. There, in the darkness, he could have been any of them. He could have been her. She almost hated him for it. Look, Marlowe, it's part of what the engine does. It doesn't... I might have killed them, Pan, he blurted out. What? Killed who? She asked, keeping her voice to a whisper. Somebody in one of the houses flicked on an upstairs light, casting a sickly yellow glow across the alley. Some guys in a car. He sniffed, scuffed the ground with his sneaker. I didn't mean to. Anyone see you? What? He looked away, and she took that as a yes. Oh, damn it. Any cameras? No, I don't think so. How the hell would I know? Because you could use your eyes, she said, biting her tongue too late. Look, you know the first rule, Marlowe. Nobody can know. That's all you care about, he said. Nobody knowing. Christ, man, I could have killed somebody. Look, Marlowe, I know what it's like. How bad you feel. Yeah? He shot back. Yeah. She took another deep breath, then opened her mouth and let the words tumble out before she could stop herself. Look, I was in care a few years back. Some guy decided he liked me. He wanted me. And there was nobody around to make him stop. So I made him stop. I made him stop everything. She choked, remembering the soft, brittle crack of his skull, remembering the way his eyes had filled with blood, the way his whole body had twitched like he was being electrocuted. I killed him because it was the only way of making it end. Marlowe was studying her intently, the alleyway suddenly quiet and still, as if the whole world had frozen. She gripped the fence, clutching the wire so hard she could feel it biting into her skin. Better to feel pain there, though, than the crushing agony in her chest. "I know how much it hurts," she said. "Guy was a creep," Marlowe said after a moment, chewing his knuckles. "He had it coming. Not them, though. I didn't even know them. I shouldn't have lashed out." "No, you shouldn't have," Pan said. "But you did. And you can't take it back. But you can make up for it." He looked at her, and she could see the desperation there, the need to make everything right. Marlowe was a mouthy, rebellious idiot, no doubt about it, but he had heart. "Herc chose you for a reason," she said. "What we're doing, it's about more than just saving one life. We're trying to save everybody. Everybody. If it wasn't for us, for me, you, Truck, and Knight, Herc, Ostheim, every single Hellraiser, even that turd Blossom Handsome, then there would be nobody left. The engines will be united, and the whole world is on a fast train to hell. You get that?" Marlowe nodded, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "One life, Marlowe. It sucks, but it's done. You know the best way to get over it? Save 1,000,000 more, 1,000,000,000. We're the only ones who can." "Yeah," he said, sucking in a ragged breath. "We're the good guys." The alley lit up as a car pulled to a halt at the end of it, the engine purring. "What about my mum, though?" Marlowe asked. "What happened to her?" "Not to her," she said, pressing a finger against Marlowe's chest. "To you. It's the engine. When you use it, you change. You've got to remember, Marlowe. You've got to remember what it is. You made a deal with the devil, or at least something as old as the devil, as old and as evil." She closed her eyes, seeing the pit inside the engine, the darkness, the creature who sat there, watching, every time she made a contract. "It's inside you now, and it changes you in good ways." She looked at him, shrugged. "Bad ones too. Sometimes it's worse than others. Some people feel it more, especially if they know you, if they love you. Animals too, like your dog. Their senses are a lot sharper than ours. But it does go away." "When the lawyers broke your contract?" he asked, his face full of hope. "Yeah." Truck flashed the high beams, and she looked away, blinking smudges of light from her vision. Provided they can break it. "Oh, yeah, sure," Marlowe said, almost smiling. "Provided the demons don't get you first." The smile took her by surprise, and her face ached as she tried to clamp her jaw shut around it. She punched Marlowe hard in the shoulder. "Ow," he said, pouting. "You don't have to be such a bitch. You don't have to be such a baby," she said. He grinned at her. "As sweet as this is," said a voice in her ear, making her jump. Herc, on the open channel. She'd completely forgotten about him. "Can you two get your asses in the car? We've found him." "Where?" she asked, putting her hand to her ear. "St. Patrick's, 5th Avenue. "The cathedral," Pan said, walking to the car. "No, the strip joint," Herc said. "Yeah, the cathedral. Get a move on. We can't risk losing him." Pan didn't think that would be a problem. She had the awful feeling that Patrick wanted to be found. "Is he alone?" "You'll find out, won't you, if you ever get there?" Pan muttered beneath her breath, opening the car door and letting Marlowe enter first. She clambered in next to him, and he looked at her. "We're definitely the good guys," he said. She nodded. "Yeah, Marlowe, we're the good guys. Now let's go do what good guys do." Truck floored it, the car burning rubber before lurching away. "Kick some evil goddamned ass." Unfinished business. That's it. It wasn't really like Knight needed to point it out. St. Patrick's Cathedral stood across the street like a corpse at a party, a sculpture of bone, Gothic towers stretching up into the night sky like skeletal fingers. It was dwarfed by the glamorous glass and steel office towers around it, and the vast bulk of the Rockefeller Center across the street. But somehow the building looked like the biggest one here, a kind of gravity that made it feel as though even the tallest skyscraper was bending down to pay its respect. It was also pumping out one hell of an evil vibe. "Anyone else getting that?" Truck asked. "I feel like a horse has just kicked me in the sphincter." It was a good way of putting it. Pan's whole body felt itchy inside, as if her blood had been replaced by feathers. If they hadn't already known that Patrick was inside the building that shared his name, they would now, the presence of the engine sending pulses through the night, making it tremble. The normals felt it too, because this section of Fifth Avenue was all but deserted. The crowds that would normally have swarmed the street had thinned to a trickle, and those few souls who trotted past moved quickly, one woman even breaking into a run until she'd crossed 50th Street. 50th Street, clutching her stomach and looking back with fear in her eyes. It was human nature to avoid evil, a warning signal in the blood, and right now that warning was blaring like a siren. He's not even trying to hide it, Pan said. And that was a bad sign, because the only reason you'd want to advertise yourself to the enemy was if you were trying to lure them into a trap. That, or you were just spoiling for a fight. He wants us here, said Truck, nodding. Herc, Pan said, talking into her collar mic. You sure there's no sign of Maman? Any other engineers? No, Maman, for sure, came his reply. Hard to read the rest. You know what consecrated ground does to the readings. Patrick might not be alone, so tread carefully. Pan nodded, flexing her fingers and feeling the charge, like she plunged her hands into a bucket of ice-cold, boiling hot water. It was hard to believe the power there, coded into her own genes by the engine. One twitch could put a hole in pretty much anything. It was exciting, but it was pretty unsettling too, like holding a live grenade with the pin pulled out. She hadn't brought the crossbow this time. Holding a weapon like that when you had a power like hers was just asking for trouble. And Guy, said Herc, for God's sake, try to keep a lid on it, okay? Oh, sure, she said. Oh yeah, no worries, added Truck. You know us. Quiet as country mice. Pan had one foot on the street when Marlowe grabbed her arm. Wait, he said. Eyes as wide and bright as the moon. I don't know what we're doing. I don't know the plan. Plan? Said Truck, clapping one giant fist into his palm. Crush his ass. No, you don't, said Herc. You take him alive so we can ask him some questions. We need him to try to get to their engine. You hear me? Alive. Sure, said Truck, forming air quotes with his fingers. Alive. I saw that, said Herc, even though there was nowhere he could have. Just keep your eyes open, Pan said to Marlowe. Patrick's pissed because of what happened to his sister. It'll make him angry, but it'll make him stupid too. Anger does that. Wait for him to expose a weakness, then move in. No way, Truck added. Not going to wait for nothing. Going to crush his ass. Truck, Herc yelled, so loud that it hurt Pan's ear. Yeah, but what's the plan, said Marlowe. What do we do? Like the big guy says, crush ass. Oh, and don't die. Crush ass, don't die, Marlowe said, shaking his head. Great. He was still grumbling as they crossed the deserted street. Somewhere in the distance a summer storm was brewing, thunder and lightning stomping the hell out of the Bronx to the north. It was hot here, her skin prickling. It was too hot. Like some of the layers between this world and theirs had peeled away. For a second she wondered whether she should turn around and go. There was always a second where that thought crossed her mind. Then she flicked it away. She'd made a choice long ago, a choice to do the right thing. This was the right thing. Besides, where else was she going to go? You want to find a way in through the back, Knight said. Pan shook her head, marching towards the steps that led to the huge bronze doors. They stood open, a soft light trickling out from inside. Nah, she said. Asshole wants a scrap. Let's give him one. She climbed the stairs and looked inside. There were no lights on in there, but there must have been 1,000 candles blazing in the main body of the building, making it look like the cathedral was on fire. Even though it was night, light from the sleepless city streamed in through the huge windows. Pan couldn't see a single sign of life, although with the flickering candlelight it was hard to be sure. He was here though. She could feel the presence of the engine, like a knife in her soul. She stepped over the threshold, a cold sweat breaking out on her skin. Sickness squirmed in her stomach the way it always did when she crossed onto hallowed ground with the engine in her blood. Every time it happened, she half expected to burst into flames, but thankfully it didn't work that way. The cathedral opened up around her, above her, far bigger than it had any right to be. It was like a cavern, the vaulted ceiling lost in shadow, the columns like some vast primeval forest. The silence was so profound it was almost a physical force, and she flexed her jaw to make her ears pop. Glancing back, she saw the others on her heels. Knight nodded to her, moving off to the side, flanking a row of long wooden pews. Truck went left, his big sneakers padding on the polished stone, the only noise in the building. Pan walked straight up the middle, slowly, her heart thrumming like a plucked string. Up ahead in the middle of the cathedral was the raised platform of the sanctuary, shrouded in a cold grey half-light. Was that a figure there? A pocket of black? Pan blinked, trying to make sense of the gloom. "Patrick," she called out, her own voice so loud that it scared her. It echoed around the empty space like a trapped bird. "You sure this is a good idea?" Marlowe whispered, so close behind he was treading on her shadow. "Patrick," Pan said, ignoring the kid. "We know you're here." A fluttering up ahead, something that might have been hushed laughter. Pan glanced to her sides to see Truck and Knight creeping through the dark. "We've got unfinished business, you and me," she said. Something popped at the far end of the cathedral, like bubble wrap. A wave of warm air rippled past her, and she recognised the shockwave a porter made when they rematerialised. There was definitely a silhouette up there, standing in front of the altar. It moved, and Pan saw that it wasn't just one silhouette, but two. She stopped, flexing her fingers, wondering if she should just attack now, while she still had the chance, burn them both to ashes. She didn't know. Orders were orders. "Unfinished business," said a voice from the twilight dark. "Yeah, I'd say that's a good way of putting it." Patrick walked down the steps and stood stooped and weary. He looked like he hadn't slept for a decade. He was wearing the same clothes he'd had on in Budapest, and they were covered in filth. When he looked up, his eyes were two pockets of darkness in his face, but they burned into Pam with an intensity that made her want to run. She stood her ground, swallowing hard, sensing Truck and Knight and Marlowe around her. "Are you going to come quietly?" she asked. "Make our lives a little easier?" Patrick smiled, a lunatic half-moon of teeth. Then he shook his head. "So you can torture me too," he said, "like you did my sister. So you can murder me and send me to hell." "Oh, come on, Patrick," Pan said. "You know the game. You make a deal, sooner or later you pay the price. You can't cheat the devil forever." "No, you can't," he said. Then he breathed a long, sad sigh. "You shouldn't have taken her, though. She wouldn't have died if you hadn't taken her." "Your lawyers should have broken her contract," Pan said. "Don't you dare blame us for that." "Yeah, let her live so she could tell you how to find us." Patrick took a step forward, jabbing a finger. She flinched, fear squeezing a spark of lightning from her finger into the marbled floor. The static crack echoed around the cathedral, acrid smoke rising into her nostrils. Patrick was unimpressed. "Brianna was never strong," he said. "She would have talked. We had to let her go. You cannot know the location of our engine." "You can't hide it forever," said Pan. "We'll make you talk, and if you don't, somebody else will. Sooner or later, we will find it." "Maybe," Patrick said. "But you won't be there to see it. None of you will. It's over for you. For all of us." "This is boring," said Truck from the aisle. "Let's just crush his ass." She opened her hand, feeling the charge building up. "He's got a point, Patrick. We didn't come here to chat." "No," he said. "You came here so you could pay for what you did to her." "That's what this is?" Pan asked. "You brought us here to avenge her." "Not me," he replied, looking over his shoulder to the second figure on the altar. "Brianna," he called softly. "Brianna, it's time." Brianna. The figure behind Patrick made a noise, a low, throaty growl like a bear. It moved, or at least it was trying to move, its limbs as shaky as a puppet's. It twitched, its whole body spasming hard for a moment before staggering into the light. Oh, God. It was Brianna Rebar, Patrick's twin, but there was something wrong with her. Her face was a patchwork doll's, badly stitched together, one side bulging grotesquely. Her body was bent and broken, like she'd just been pulled from a car crash. She was naked, but her skin was so burned and so scarred that she looked like she was clothed in a corpse's flesh. Her hair had all but fallen out, clumps hanging down in thin, greasy strands. Her eyes were glassy and blind. Dead eyes. "Oh, Patrick," said Pan, stumbling back, grabbing a pew to stop herself from falling. The last time she'd seen Brianna, she'd been bitten in half, dragged into the fire. "What did you do?" She knew exactly what he'd done. He'd traded for her. He'd made a deal to bring his sister back from hell. It was one of the first rules, one of the things you could never ask for. You cannot bring back the dead. Ostheim had told her on day one, it is impossible. All you could do was conjure up a memory of them, a worm bag stuffed with rot and jelly, something cold and old and wrong. And you definitely couldn't bring back the dead from hell, because when you did that, they brought something back with them. It was the only way, Patrick said, smiling. His own eyes had a glassy sheen, the look of somebody pushed way over the edge. Only Maman would be sick enough to let somebody make a deal with the engine in that frame of mind. He'd just condemned his own engineer to an eternity of suffering. You know they can't break it, Pan said. That contract is too hard. You're screwed. He shrugged, watching Brianna as she shuffled down the stairs. She missed one, then went sprawling, landing with a sound like a garbage bag exploding on the curb. Slowly, painfully, she picked herself up. Life doesn't mean much without her, Patrick said. We came into this world together. I guess we'll leave it together. You'll spend the rest of time in hell together, Pan said, just so Maman can have his way. Better than the alternative, Patrick said. Better than what you and Ostheim are proposing. Sure, said Pan. End of the world. So much better. He looked back at her, those oil-black eyes blinking. You don't get it, do you? You're so blind to the truth that you can't even see what you're fighting for. Don't you dare, she shot back. You're the bad guy in this equation, not me. Ostheim has only ever tried to do the right thing. Patrick laughed, shaking his head. All this time, fighting for the wrong side. You could have joined us, Pan. The things we could have given you. Yeah, a dead sister and a one-way ticket to the devil's playground. She snorted, a humourless laugh. Man, I totally messed up that decision. Just tell us where we can find your engine. At least that way your last few minutes on Earth won't be spent with me beating it out of you. It's too late, Patrick said. You'll never know. You'll never know how wrong you were. Impatience was gnawing at Pan's soul, and she took a step forward, energy crackling between her fingers, her whole body fizzing. That was the thing about dealing for electromagnetic abilities. It was as uncomfortable as a suit of electric wire. Yeah, she said. How'd you figure that? 4 of us against you and a worm bag? Sounds like pretty good odds. Patrick just smiled at her. Brianna had stumbled to his side, almost doubled over, her eyes looking like they might roll out and shatter on the floor. Even now Pan could see that they were twins, even though Brianna was like a mirror image that had rotted, a twisted shadow that had torn itself free from Patrick's feet. He seemed to know this because he looked at her with an expression of profound sadness. I didn't just bring her back, he said quietly. I made her something terrible. Brianna straightened like an old lady, the sound of breaking bones echoing around the cathedral. She uttered that throbbing growl. Then, without warning, she threw her head back and shrieked. The noise was so loud it was a physical force, a fist that punched into the darkness of the ceiling. Terrible and unending. Dust and rubble rained down as Pan staggered back, hands to her ears, that scream like a tornado as it churned up the air. It cut out, and Brianna's head snapped down again. Her eyes were burning, literally sizzling in their sockets. The cathedral was full of the smell of cooked meat and sulphur. I made her a monster, Patrick said, wiping tears from his own eyes. They're yours, Brianna. Take them. Brianna screamed again, and all hell arrived. Eek. I'll read a couple more. Next chapter is called Crush Ass, Don't Die. Marlowe screamed. It was the only thing he was capable of doing. The girl's shrieking howl ripped up the floor of the cathedral, marble and stone rising like a wave. The vibrations threatened to shatter his bones, the noise unbearable. He had time to see Pan throw herself to one side, a slab of brick crunching off her skull. Then it was on him, a tsunami of dust and debris that thundered forwards. Something thumped into his side, the tackle sending him skidding across the floor. He covered his face with his hands. It's easier to fight with your eyes open, said Knight, and he looked to see her there, crouched beside him. Behind her, the wave of debris rolled into the wall where he'd been standing, making the whole building tremble. A groaning howl rose up above the crash, and it took Marlowe a moment to realise the church organ was collapsing, the pipes blowing out curdled notes as they clanged to the ground. Knight helped him to his feet, and he had to clamp another scream in his throat. In the middle of the cathedral, Brianna was a statue of fire, burning from head to toe. She didn't seem to notice, taking a step forward and thrusting out her arms. A jet of blue flame tore out, engulfing the first few rows of pews in an explosion of wood. A shockwave of heat burned through the air, hot enough that Marlowe could feel his hair sizzle, even from 30 feet away. He lifted his hand over his face, blinking away tears. When he looked again, he saw Pan crawling away from the fire, her clothes singed, her head bleeding. She rolled onto her back and shot something at the girl, a bolt of forked white lightning that crackled upwards, missing its target and shattering one of the windows in a rain of stained glass. The building shook again, moaned in protest, a crack of thunder almost splitting Marlowe's skull open. Brianna reached out, another fountain of liquid fire shooting from her hands. Something slapped into her, a streak of light that could only be night. The impact knocked the burning girl back, her flames spitting and spluttering like napalm, so hot that it was setting fire to the stone. Marlowe started to run, time crawling into silence, the fire burning in slow motion, almost beautiful as it curled upwards, dancing on its own heat. He dodged pieces of plaster and mortar that hung suspended in midair, sprinting down the centre aisle and stopping when he reached Pam. Time snapped back with a sickening punch, the sound and fury blasting back on. The heat here was insane, blistering his skin as he grabbed her under the arms. There was something electric in her, like holding onto a live wire, but he clung on, dragging her back. She fired off another deafening pulse of lightning, this one hitting Brianna in the chest and sending her cartwheeling back through the cathedral. "No!" Patrick yelled, vanishing with a soft pop. "Watch!" was all he heard Pan say before the air ruptured next to Marlowe and Patrick appeared. He threw a punch that connected with Marlowe's gut, launching him up. The world spun, and he landed on a pew hard enough to crush it to splinters. It was like Patrick had reached in and grabbed his lungs, because when he tried to breathe, he found he couldn't. He whined like a beaten dog, clawing at the air until his solar plexus started working again. What the hell was he doing? He was going to die. Hands on him, wrenching him off the ground like he was a toddler. Then he was airborne again, slamming into one of the stone columns and dropping to the floor. The pain was like nothing he had ever felt, carving through him like a circular saw in his spine. He pushed himself to his feet just as Patrick ported back into the world, the boy's teeth bared, his eyes full of a madness that made Marlowe want to scream again. "Got you," Patrick said, wrapping a hand around Marlowe's throat. Marlowe swung his fist, but Patrick dodged the punch. He tried again, squirming in the iron grip, darkness starting to creep in at the edge of his vision. Something exploded against Patrick's head, and he released his grip, staggering away. Truck was there, the big guy holding a 20-foot pew like it was a baseball bat. He swung it again, and it broke in half against Patrick's back, sending him tumbling down the aisle like a bag of bones. Marlowe didn't hesitate, grabbing a pew of his own. It was solid oak, but as light as a feather, and he swung it in a wild arc towards Patrick. It was longer than he thought, glancing off the side of a pillar, jarring his spine so hard he thought he'd been ripped out of his back. He lifted the pew again for another strike, but Patrick ported. Marlowe spun around, waiting for him to reappear. The cathedral was ablaze. A curtain of fire almost hitting the ceiling. Brianna was back, striding through the flame, her whole body shimmering in its burning shroud. A black hole opened up in the furnace of her face, and she screamed again, a physical force that blasted through the church, lifting pews from the ground and scattering them. Marlowe couldn't see Pan anywhere in the ocean of smoke, and was halfway to calling her name when a forked branch of lightning exploded from the far end of the building, hitting Brianna and knocking her back. She lay on the floor, writhing and twitching. Pam was striding out of the coiling smoke, a face like murder. She pulled her hand back like she was going to pitch a baseball, then she thrust it forward, grimacing. The whole cathedral lit up like it was dawn, Marlowe shielding his eyes with his hands to stop himself from going blind. The noise was incredible, a million firecrackers going off at once. "Come on!" Truck grabbed his arm, dragging him across the church to where Brianna squirmed. Marlowe coughed smoke out of his lungs, blinking tears and light from his vision, trying to see where he was going. "Take that one!" Truck yelled, pointing to a column. He ran to the next one along, charging it like a defensive tackle bringing down a quarterback. It split on contact, a crack running all the way up to the ceiling. Marlowe jogged to his and punched it, his fist blasting through the stone, sending shrapnel flying. The ceiling above them groaned, sagging. He punched again and the column broke, crumbling earthward and bringing half the roof with it. Truck barged his way through the wall to avoid the falling stone. Marlowe ran too, the world spinning slower. He dodged falling rocks as he sprinted across the cathedral, tripping on a broken pew and sprawling back into real time. Dust and dirt rained down on him, the ceiling disintegrating overhead. A chunk of wood and stone the size of a car broke free and crashed earthwards. Pan aimed her power up, lightning tearing off a second piece, even bigger, which landed on Brianna with a dull crunch. Smaller pieces followed, burying the girl alive. Or dead, whatever she was. Pan stopped firing, shaking her hands like they were hot, her face a mask of pain. There was a cry from across the aisle, and Marlowe looked to see Patrick, his expression so full of hate and anger that he looked demonic. "Not again!" he screamed. "Not again! Not again!" Then Knight was there, blocking the view, saying, "We should go, whole place is going to collapse." Marlowe took her hand and pulled himself up, every cell in his body aching. Pan stumbled to them, her hands so black she might have had them on the barbecue. She smelled of summer storms, and Marlowe reached out, propping her up, her skin hot against his own. She opened her mouth to say something, then stopped, staring at the pile of rubble where Brianna had fallen. It was moving. Something pushed up from the mess, a thin, red stalk that could have been a plant. It stretched further, and Marlowe saw that it was an arm, stripped to the bone. Scraps of flesh hanging off it. 5 mangled fingers extended like petals, swaying back and forth, almost as if they were waving. Patrick's sobs had become something else, a lunatic laughter that rose above the roaring flames, above the ringing in Marlowe's ears. "Not good," said Pam. That was an understatement. The mountain of debris was shaking, and with a bone-jarring crack, it split in two. Brianna appeared in the gap, her body broken beyond recognition. Her skin had split in a dozen different places, slick purple organs poking out and swinging gently as she moved. It's gross. Her head had been crushed, the top of her skull missing, hollowed out. But that didn't stop her scuttling out on all fours. Her toothless jaw hung like a broken branch, and she gargled through it, a single bloody word that might have been her brother's name. Pan stretched out her fingers, and a bolt of cold light ripped out. But Brianna was faster, scampering spider-like to the side as the ground blasted into dust behind her. She vanished into the smoke, but Marlowe could still hear her hands and feet pattering wetly on the rock, moving fast, circling them. "You're all dead!" yelled Patrick, still laughing. "You're finished!" "Oh, you guys, go shut him up," said Pan, wiping her face and smearing soot all over it. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were clear. "I've got the worm bag." Marlowe nodded, taking a deep breath and walking towards Patrick. He'd never felt this tired in his life, never been in so much pain. Death was stalking him, hovering over his shoulder, just out of sight. And death was the least of his worries, too, because where he was going, the fires burned way hotter than this. "You're finished!" Patrick screamed, filling the air with lunatic howls. "You're finished!" Yeah, thought Marlowe. He had a bad feeling. He was right. Now, the next chapter is called Goddamned Worm Bag. I might leave that one. How many pages have we read today? How many pages have we read today? I never remember how many pages I can do. So what is that? Alright, read one more. It's a really short one. It's called Goddamned Worm Bag. Pan ran, stumbling over the loose stone. The ceiling was still raining chunks of plaster, the whole thing coming to pieces. Worse still, she could hear sirens from outside, closing fast. The place would soon be flooded with cops and firemen, and Herc would be chewing her a new one. If she lived, of course. She heard shouts, glanced to the side to see Marlowe and Knight bursting in and out of real time as they attacked Patrick. She left them to it. She had bigger things to worry about. The back of the cathedral was a wall of flame, like the building had been sculpted from fire. She had to squint at it because it was so bright, holding her hand up against its heat. Something shimmered there, a shape scuttling across the broken ground. She opened her fingers and felt the energy build up, the air crackling as she fired off a painful burst of electrostatic discharge. It thumped into the fire, fighting it, creating a storm of light and flame. Brianna had long gone, moving impossibly fast on those broken bones. "Where are you?" Pan muttered beneath her breath, ignoring the agony in her hands. Sweat dripped into her eyes, blood too, although she didn't remember getting cut. She wiped it away, moving sideways across the width of the cathedral, trying to make sense of the fluttering shadows behind the remaining pillars. Brianna was a worm bag, the worst of the worst. She was capable of anything, but she had no soul, no mind, a madness of cruelty and horror that Patrick had wound up and let loose. There. Something scuttled between the pillars, and Pan ran for it, vaulting an upturned pew. The shape reared in the shadows, stretching up, too tall to be human. As Pan got closer, she saw that Brianna's body was unravelling, her spine stretching. The girl's skin tore, her top half ripping free, rising like a cobra out of a basket of ribs. Guts slopped to the floor, the stench of ruptured intestines making Pan gag. Brianna screamed, and Pan threw herself to the side as a solid fist of noise blasted past. She rolled to her feet, dodging to the side, keeping the pillar in between her and the girl. Brianna's crushed head peered around the side of it. Her neck was a snake's, 4 times longer than it should be, her skin pulled taut and torn in places to reveal the slick cords of muscle beneath. Her drooping jaw shook, and fragments of words dropped like spilled teeth. Her eyes had been burned out, just gaping holes in her ruined skull, but she still looked right at Pan. "Yeah, make the most of it," Pan said. "You're going right back to hell." Brianna's top lip, what was left of it, curled up, the closest thing she could manage to a smile. There was definitely life in those eye sockets, but Pan understood it didn't belong to Brianna. Something else was looking at her, something much, much worse than a worm bag. Pan jabbed both of her hands out. Lightning burned from her fingertips, carving through the pillar, so bright that even though she screwed her eyes closed, the world still blazed white. She kept it going until it felt like her fingers had been burned to stubs. Then she snapped it off, staggering back. There was a hole in the side of the cathedral, darkness pouring in through the gap. She could see the street outside, the gaping hole in the building opposite. Sparks flew from ruptured cables, brick dust crumbling. There was no sign of... Something moved overhead, a spider clawing over the remains of the ceiling. Brianna was missing one leg, but she was still quick, a tangled mass of sinew and skin that spasmed towards her and dropped. She landed on Pan, a wet, stinking bag that thrashed and squirmed. Pan grunted, pushing against it, feeling Brianna's fingers drill into her chest, into her neck, feeling the girl's flapping jaw rub against her face. Something sliced through her stomach, and the world was suddenly made of cold fire. The stump of Brianna's leg bone was lodged in her flesh, pushing deeper. Her fingers too had pierced the skin of her chest, like the girl was trying to climb inside her, trying to wear her like a coat. "No!" she grunted, punching up. Her fist ripped off a loose fold of cheek skin, and it stuck to her knuckles. This is grim. But Brianna didn't notice, her body rocking, her bones grating against Pan's. She placed her palm against Brianna's face and unleashed a burst of energy. There was a sound like a watermelon exploding, and Brianna's head vanished in a spray of blood and bone. Her body twitched violently, a spasm rocking through her. Pan pushed it away, shrieking as the girl's dagger bones ripped free of her flesh. The one in her stomach stuck, and she grabbed it with both hands, pulling it until it came free with a sucking sound. The Brianna thing was a mound of flesh, twitching its way towards the hole in the cathedral wall like a headless chicken. Pan pushed herself up, trying to get to her feet. The world spun and she dropped to her knees, blood leaking out of her wounds, pattering to the ground and steaming on the hot stone. She backed against a pew and sat there, trying to find her breath. The fire was everywhere now. Death couldn't be far away. At least the demons would feel at home when they came for her. Bring it on, she told them, wondering if dying in a cathedral would give her soul a fighting chance in hell, knowing that it wouldn't make the slightest bit of difference. She put her hand to her ear. Truck? Nothing. Night? Nothing but static. Damn it, why do I have to do everything? The worm bag was almost out, and something else was happening to it. The remaining scraps of skin seemed to be bulging, like somebody was inflating Brianna's corpse with a pump. A wet, red bladder was pushing its way out of the stump of her neck, a clutch of pus-filled eyes bulging open in the mess. Pan swore, gritting her teeth as she staggered to her feet. She held her stomach like she was holding in the last few scraps of life, wondering if she had it in her to make it outside, and knowing what would happen if she didn't. Oh, come back here, you goddamned worm bag, she said, wiping the blood from her mouth. I'm not done with you yet. Good old Pan. Next chapter, which we'll come to tomorrow, is called We Should Probably Kill It. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 chapters left. So we should finish that either tomorrow or the day after, I don't know, whenever I get a chance. I hope you enjoyed that. That was really grim. I don't remember this book being so disgusting, but it's pretty cool. A red wet bladder pushing itself out the stump of her neck. I did really enjoy writing this. I hope you're enjoying it too. I hope you weren't eating like tomato soup or anything, or chili con carne, or like raw steak. Is anyone with raw steak? I don't know. Sausages or anything like that while you were listening, because that would be gross. Anyway, have a nice rest of the day, and I will see you soon. I should have had a haircut as well by the next time I see you. So be a little bit shorter and maybe a little bit less like this. I'm looking a bit like a worm bag. Anyway, hope you're well. And yeah, I'll see you all soon. Bye.